بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى آل محمد. In his name I begin with the best of blessings on the noblest of prophets and the Lord and the beloved of our hearts, Muhammad and his progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Respected sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you all. Is there anyone to help us? Came out the call. Is there anyone to aid us? He called out again. Is there anybody out there to assist us? Again he called. Hal min nasirin yansuruna, calling out across the sands of times 14 centuries ago, calling out 4 times to all of the corners of the earth. These anguished calls came out from the man who had just watched one by one of his companions be killed, and one by one his family, from cousins, nephews, sons, brothers, and infant son, be slaughtered right in front of his eyes, while his beloved sister, daughters, and womenfolk, all deprived of water for 3 days under the unrelenting desert sun, also witnessed the unbelievable calamities unfolding. He called out, knowing that no one will come to his aid. Yet he kept calling out through the centuries to awaken the slumbering consciousness of a sleeping nation, gluttonous in its corruption and ripe in its oppressing of the truth. He was calling out to humanity through time to restore, not revolutionize, his grandfather's nation. I have risen not for the purpose of exuberance, arrogance, corruption, but I have done so in order to seek restoration in the nation of my grandfather Muhammad. I wish to enjoin good and forbid evil. I want to follow the path and tradition of my grandfather Muhammad and the path of my father Ali ibn Abi Talib. The mere name of this man inspires poets and reciters to create beauty from the pain of the pure blood spilled in sacrifice, of protecting the lineage of the prophets. The whisper of his name draws tears to spill, and every tear falling falls with his name down the lover's cheeks. What is it about this man that inspires people in the millions to come to his grave and honor his sacrifice with the allegiance of renewing their vows to enjoin good and forbid evil, and to stay witness to the tragedies he, his companions, and family experienced? What is it about this man that lifts the deepest of sores from the heaviest of hearts and lightens it with faith and light, teaching us lessons to try and apply to all aspects of our lives at all levels, from the political, religious, social, spiritual, and psychological? Many lecturers, scholars, and speakers every year during the Majalis or gatherings during the first 10 to 13 days of the new Islamic year of the month of Muharram, culminating on the day of Ashura, the 10th, discuss a variety of topics relevant to our social norms in the hopes of allowing the attendees to leave with new knowledge and renewed inspiration to carry on in their lives. Within the Majlis, we also express our grief and sorrow and perform the Aza, the mourning, through the Latmiyat, the elegies, by the talented and beautiful voices and verses of the Raduds, the reciters. With each Majlis, we complete with the yearning words of the ziyarah, renewing our vows to the Imam and asking permission to visit in person to perform this sacred visit that has immense spiritual and psychological healing. We know this year it's going to be very different. As a psychotherapist, working with the mind, soul, and spirit to help clients reach their full potential in life, including work through life challenges or living with mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety, or personality disorders, I'm always amazed to see how people can work through their life challenges while still living with the dignity to respect the part of themselves that makes them human. Deep depression can debilitate a person from reaching their full potential. However, in psychological research, studies show that there is a significant positive connection between a person having a spiritual religious inclination in their lives and their overall psychological and mental well-being. In other words, having a spiritual and religious path in life has a positive and healing influence to help cope and to overcome and work through mental illnesses and life's challenges. Various coping strategies, such as prayers, the relationship between man and God through faith, belief in God and His mercy, as well as trusting God as what happens is best for man, all have a significant impact on the believer's way of dealing with challenges. As Muslims, specifically as followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, we embody these values as intrinsically part of what defines us and is part of our Hussaini identity, especially living in the West. Our basic duties as Muslims, from salah, dua, zakah, hajj, helping the needy, and so on, have all spiritual and psychological implications on the soul to refine and cleanse our spirit, to reach again our highest potentials with the divine and within our society. The Majlis itself is a huge defining aspect of our identity, where we relive the story of Karbala and try to apply the lessons from the tragedy to our lives at a personal level. But also it is vital that we apply these lessons within all aspects of our lives from, again, the political, the religious, social, and community level. And especially considering the backlash that we see against Muslims worldwide these days, as seen through Islamophobia, and especially the challenges that we're experiencing this year, considering the pandemic that we are living through. So, with these in mind, I ask you, how does the tradition of the Majlis have an impact on our psychological and our mental health? And how does knowing this help us to answer the call? Is there anyone to help us? Now, before discussing the connection between the two, I'd like to briefly explore the history and evolution of the Majlis Aza al-Hussaini and its implications. We'll then discuss the deep connection of Ashura mourning, of the English and Arabic lectures, recitations and ziyaras of the highly spiritual atmosphere of Majlis Abu Abdullah al-Hussain, and how we can choose to answer that heart-wrenching call. Again, because of the unusual year that we have had so far in 2020. During the holy month of Ramadan, we made it through, alhamdulillah. And now, during the holy season of Muharram, during the pandemic, we know, and we're already seeing it and we're living it, that the Majalis are very different. However, and subhanAllah, they are still continuing in very creative ways, through drive-thrus, through lives, through Zoom, through online programs, whether it's small numbers in the actual centers and masajids and Hussainiyas, with alternating times, and people perhaps within their own homes. We can see that every home now has now become a space for a Majlis, potentially for our children and for us. SubhanAllah, how even in these difficult circumstances, we can reframe it to look at how the Majlis is now within our home, and we are creating this awareness for ourselves in such a different way this year. Let's begin. Bismillah. The institution of the Majlis itself is a powerful tool to connect ourselves to the beloved Imam. It began long before the actual events on Ashura, as it began on the day Al-Hussain alayhi salam was born, where his martyrdom was foretold by the angel Gabriel to the Rasul, and where Lady Fatima, Imam Ali, and the family would mourn his death during his life. The first public Aza, of course, took place in the markets of Kufa by the Lady of Patience herself, Sayyida Zainab alayhi salam, where she and the chained children and women and the fourth Imam Ali Sajjad alayhi salam were paraded as captives of war after the Battle of Karbala. Despite the horrific tragedies she witnessed in the year 61 or 680, in her formidable spirit, she stared down the celebrating people of Kufa, rejoicing the victory of Yazid, and said, "Woe upon you, O people of Kufa! Do you realize which piece of Muhammad's heart you have severed? Which pledge you have broken? Whose blood you have shed? Whose honor you have desecrated? It is not just Hussein whose headless body lies unburied on the sands of Karbala. It is the heart of the Holy Prophet. It is the very soul of Islam. Her words immediately halted the celebrations and sent the audiences weeping in shame and regret, which also set in motion for al-Mukhtar's mission for vengeance. The city of Medina heard about the events of Karbala 10 days after Ashura through Yazid's messenger, where the frantic response in Kufa, the governor of Medina was aware of how the response would be after. So, sure enough, after Fajr prayers, the city was loud with cries and tears with the horrific news of the slaughter of the beloved grandson of the Prophet. The families and womenfolk of the household of Bani Hashim would go to Jannat al-Baqi' to weep their tragic losses, and their cries would be heard all over. Back in Sham, the exhausted and traumatized women and children were brought like common captives in Yazid's court. It is here that Lady Zainab shook the grip of terror that Yazid had attempted to inflict upon the Ummah by publicly shaming the tyrant and exposing his corruption for all of the court to see. She sent grown men to their knees weeping with all that had befallen Ali Muhammad, with the recounting of the injustice that had occurred in Karbala. She and the son of Hussain, Imam Ali Sajjad, the ill survivor of the tragedy, began to awaken the sleeping minds of the masses who had succumbed to the greed and corruption of Yazid. I encourage you to read the sermon given by Sayyida Zainab in Yazid's courts with great attention, for it is at the very core of what Al-Hussein had risen up against to restore Islam back to his grandfather's religion. This place of Aza in the opulent palaces of Yazid again began to crumble his terrorist hold on the slumbering minds. It began an awakening to the great sacrifice of the Imam. Now, when they were released by Yazid, the prisoners requested their rights to mourn their loved ones and had Aza in a house for a week. As people of faith, we are from him, and to him we return, is the core of their beliefs that gave them the patience to cope with these tragedies. For they know that this is the path that they are on. It is not just the mourning and the sadness of losing the beloveds, but it was the reason why they were brutally murdered. That is the message behind all of this. It was in the land of Al-Hussein's enemies and murderers that his sister again laid the base of the Majlis al-Husseini, and upon returning to Medina, Lady Zainab also continued the Aza, stirring up the hearts of the people, where her words and stance bore witness to Karbala and for the Muslim world to awaken. The enemies were so terrified by her influence that she was exiled from Medina to Sham, where she shortly passed away in the year 62. Today, her shrine still bears the attacks of terrorists who try to silence her. Yet we see, despite her steady visitors and protective Abbasis, never stop from going to her aid. And of course, 40 days after Ashura, the first Ziyarat al-Arba'in took place, where the beloveds went back to the beloveds to mourn their departed beloveds. We know the spectacular level to what the Arba'iniyah has become, the largest peaceful gathering of the millions in the world today that has ever seen. And of course, the generosity and the core values of what the Ahl al-Bayt stood for is illuminated through this stance, subhanallah. This year, we will not see this, even as the Arba'in will still continue on, but without its millions, close but far. Now, we see that this Majlis Aza again came about to the early years of the 4th and the 5th Imams, Ali Sajjad and Muhammad al-Baqir alayhum salam, where they encouraged the Majlis, however through secrecy, as during their lifetime there was severe persecution from the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasty to crush any threat they felt against their rule. Despite that, we see how the poets and the reciters kept on composing their elegies and recited at the risk of their lives. And it was during the imamate of the 6th Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, where officially these majalis became established, but still in secrecy due to the persecution. Soon after the custom of the ziyarah came about, our imams wrote for the people who would visit the graves of the martyrs, one of which is Ziyarat al-Waritha, where it is a testimony of the greatness of the Imam, his great sacrifice for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and its solemn pledge by us the reciters as an answer to his call. During the occultation, our Imams made it obligatory for us to recite the ziyarah and to continue their traditions. From the year 329 on, scholars and followers of the Ahlul Bayt, taking the lead and encouragement of the Imams, made it their mission to spread the message of Karbala, as it is not only a show of grief for the martyrdom, but also a renewal of one's commitment to Allah and His laws, as explained in the Holy Quran and in the Hadith. We tend to forget this when attending the Majalis, where there sometimes tends to be a lack of respect when the speaker is presenting their lecture for us to learn and benefit from. It almost becomes a place of gossip, jokes, and drama. People will speak when the lecturer is speaking, yet will cry at the point of the majlis when retelling the tragedy. We know this, we see it all the time. Or people will participate during the latam. Meanwhile, they haven't listened to a word. They've been gossiping, chatting, and all of that while the speaker is speaking. The majlis is so much more than tears and the beating of our chests. If you don't have respect for the speaker, then at least let's have some respect for whom the speaker is speaking of. One just needs to think of how the Imam and the early followers of the Ahlul Bayt were persecuted to fully appreciate the freedoms that we have today, despite the pandemic that we are in being able to hold these gatherings. As we well know, Shias around the world today cannot easily do what we are able to do. Yemen, Syria, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Bahrain, Kuwait, Al-Awamiya, Kashmir, the list goes on and on. In 351, public demonstrations of grief on the 10th of Muharram were seen in the streets of Baghdad with the chants of Ya Hussain, with latam and recitations. That same year, Egypt also witnessed the same public display of grief. And no matter how hard the regimes in power tried to stop these processions, they could not, as at that point, the Azza had become deeply rooted in the traditions of Muslims, enjoining good and forbidding evil. History showed, as Islam spread, the different cultures and diverse ethnicities developing their own expression of Azza that was best understood in their own languages, customs, and medium throughout India, Spain, and China. By the 19th century, all of these areas and more had some form of resemblance of Ashura. It is so beautiful to see the various cultural expression of grief and renewal of allegiance to the Imam's sacrifice as seen from its development from region to region in the past century. And we see the rise and the fall of the ruling regimes and their effect on the Majlis from Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, and so forth. And it's been fascinating to see in the Western world the last 10 to 15 years how the youth have taken on an active role in preserving the message of Imam Hussain through the English Majalis, where we hear English lectures, English na'i, and even English latam. This is due to the high need of our youth wanting to connect and to understand in a language and a medium in which they can fully participate in through their various talents and abilities to contribute again to the restoration of the Imam's message. More and more communities, the elders, including the Marja'iyah, are realizing the importance of such programs and initiatives, conferences, and organizations like the Nainawa Conference in Toronto, the Who is Hussein movement, virtual reality Karbala, blood drives, charity work, and the list goes on and on. And we can see, especially now during the pandemic, the different creative ways of how we are continuing this, how the youth and the youngsters are just finding different ways of trying to spread that message and to keep the message alive. So we see how the work on spreading the message of Imam Hussain through the different mediums are happening, especially through our youth. I cannot stress enough how vital it is that we continue these types of initiatives while still maintaining the tradition to the cause of the Imam's sacrifice. It is so vital. And the elders in our community, bless them, they need to properly train and empower the youth to allowing them to take over to create these initiatives. For how else will we be able to preserve the message if not through the nurturing of the love of the Imam in the young hearts of our youth? And in nurturing and preserving these young hearts, it's important to raise strong youth, the next Hussaini generation, sound in mind, in body, and in spirit. The Majalis can provide the attendee the space, and even in the homes, to develop their spirituality through the cleansing of the soul, through the grief expressed over the tragedies of the Imam and his household. In the act of mourning, in the moment of mourning, the self goes through various psychological stages, from shock, denial, pain, anger, and acceptance of the loss and living with the loss. Comparatively, in the Hussaini Majalis, we can see we're always in shock of the tragedies, no matter how many times we've heard the story. There's almost a denial. The experiences that the self experiences at the level of the atrocities that Ali Muhammad experienced, from prevention of the water to the women and children, in the way in which each of the martyrs were killed, especially the murder of the 6-month-old infant Abdullah. We experience intense pain when we hear the pain of Lady Zainab and all of the calamities she sees and has to endure before the battle, during, and afterwards. There is also the anger we feel in our hearts at the injustices and the outright inhumane mistreatment of the pure ones, and how the enemies, blinded by the greed of this material world, took over, and how it took over their souls to kill the grandson of the very prophet they claimed to follow. The irony. And in acceptance of losses, we see the strength of Lady Zainab's patience in her epic words of "I see nothing but beauty." For how else can she bear to see her brother's protective arms, the moon and gaze, be severed near the very river he sought to quench the children's thirst from? Or see her brother the sun, his light dimmed by the severing of his head from his body? Yet she saw nothing but beauty and all of this sacrifice by living with the losses and reminders of what she had to do to continue the initial sacrifice of Hussein and carry on the responsibility of restoring her grandfather's religion with grace, patience, and dignity as no one else could. The plethora of lessons from Karbala learned through the Majalis allow us to strengthen our ties to the Imams, yes, to renew our allegiance to his cause, yes, but also allow us to garner strength from their strength to apply to the challenges we experience in our daily lives as well, especially these days in the world that we are living in. When we experience extreme difficulties, we can recall the difficulties of the Ahlul Bayt and how they handled them as an absolute source of guidance and inspiration for us to also work through our challenges and troubles. Every sincere tear that we shed in the Majalis, we know is being counted as ajr. Psychologically, when a tear is released, there are chemicals that are also released from the body, toxins that relieve distress. So imagine the multiple benefits of the tears released in the Majlis of Al-Hussein and what it does to the mind, body, and spirit, especially of the sincere believer. The Majlis, although a place of mourning and sorrow, is also a holy place of heightened spiritual connections that allow the spirit to reach, release, and experience that tranquility. And it is this spiritual space that has a huge psychological impact on the mind and soul to allow a person to be influenced by faith and the divine. It is in this frame of mind that the human soul can achieve wonders within itself and for the betterment of those around them. I know those people who are struggling with depression and anxiety, perhaps the mourning season of Muharram may elicit more intense emotions. And you know what? It's okay. You don't necessarily have to go or participate in a way if it will deepen your sorrow. But at the same time, it may relieve some of your own personal struggles by experiencing the spiritual experience and inspiration of the Majlis. So it's truly up to you. And I see this in people who all the time try to ask these questions around mental health and depression and mourning and grief, because it could potentially intensify your own emotions of depression and grief. But there is also the added benefit that during the spiritual atmosphere of the Majlis, it can also help in your healing as well. And also it is this evolving human being that we see, right? Who has the ability to truly answer that call of the Imam from across the centuries. The name of Hussain, as we know today, has transcended the Muslim world, and it is slowly becoming known to the rest of the world as a symbol of the man who stood up against tyranny and corruption with dignity, and whose ultimate sacrifice to God was to enjoin good and forbid evil. Over the next 10 to 13 days, I invite you to open up your mind, body, and spirit to allow yourself the opportunity to be able to reach this level of purity. The lectures prepared by our esteemed scholars and speakers and researchers and elegies by our reciters will allow you the chance to make the changes within yourself and for those around you. It doesn't matter that we are not in the same Majlis space, the physical space of our Hussainiyas and masjids. We can create that at home still by setting up the decoration of the black within our homes, by dressing, by talking to our children, explaining to our children, still cooking perhaps, and even sharing this food with our neighbors, our friends and families, and even to our non-Muslim friends, and even Muslims of other schools of thoughts, to share in the message of Hussain and the barakah and the blessings. We can still do this. The pandemic will not stop us from continuing on with our majalis. Inshallah, I will be exploring psychological concepts in relation to these holy nights. And so you have the choice to consciously awaken your spirit by making a contract within yourself to change something within you. What can you do for yourself and others during these holy days and nights that you can carry over for the rest of the year? What can this change perpetuate in your life to help answer that call? Is there anyone to help us? How does each of the nights impact you? Or what lessons do they teach you? And how do you choose to answer that call? And what do you choose to answer that call with? Labbayka ya Hussain, Labbayka ya Hussain. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.